Beneath the sighing branches of the Carolina pines, the air hung heavy with quiet expectancy. The kind of hush that settles just before a summer thunderstorm, where birds fall silent and the leaves hold their breath. In the spring of 1861, the land itself seemed to sense the shift, as though the very soil knew that the peace it had cradled for decades was drawing its last breath. Across the American South, a gentle but insistent murmur was rising, a whisper that would become a cry that would become a war. In a small, red-dusted town known as Bell Hollow, tucked between meadows and muddy creeks, life still moved, with the deliberate pace of tradition. Its streets were lined with aging oaks, their branches tangled like the stories passed from front porch to pew. Farmers still tipped their hats, boys still chased dogs through the fields, and women hung, linen to dry beneath skies that had not yet known the smoke of cannon fire. But underneath these routines, something old was unraveling. Young Elias Calhoun was just 17 that spring, though his heart had long been older. With sun-browned skin and a mind filled with more questions than answers, he spent his days helping his father mend fences, hauling feed from the old barn, and sneaking moments to sit by the river with a book half read. His world had always been simple, stitched together with the rhythms of the land and the comfort of knowing that tomorrow would look very much like today. But even Elias, with his quiet soul and wide eyes, could sense the change creeping in like a distant fog. The men in town spoke differently now. In the barbershop, the lilt of old hunting stories had given way to hushed debates about statehood and federal power. On Sundays, the preacher's voice thundered less about eternal salvation and more about Southern honor and divine justice. Even at the general store, where once the loudest sound had been the clink of molasses jars, talk of Fort Sumter and President Lincoln had begun to rattle louder than any coin in a till. Elias listened. Always, he listened. He listened to his father, who muttered beneath his breath as he read the broadsheets from Charleston. He listened to the postmaster, who stood tall despite his limp and read aloud the daily telegrams to a gathering crowd outside the dusty station door. And most of all, Elias listened to the silence between the words, those long pauses where a man would stare at his boots, wondering whether his son might march into battle or be left behind in shame. The rumors grew legs, as folks like to say, and began to run faster than reason. Bell Hollow would send its boys, surely, just as every town in the South would. There was talk of forming a company, of electing captains, of sewing colours into flags that had yet to be raised. And among those boys, the blacksmith's twin sons, the shoemaker's apprentice, and the schoolteacher's nephew, Elias found himself standing, heart thrumming like a distant drum. At night, the farmhouse where Elias lived seemed smaller than ever, its wooden walls groaning with age. His mother, weary-eyed but strong, baked cornbread with more fervour than usual, as though trying to fill the house with warmth that might linger long after footsteps were gone. His younger sister Annabelle hummed lullabies beneath the window, unaware that those songs would soon carry different meanings. Elias would lie on his straw mattress, fingers laced behind his head, and stare at the ceiling beams. He imagined uniforms and bayonets, letters home and long marches through unfamiliar woods. He wondered whether war was truly the proving ground of manhood, as the elders claimed, or simply a place where innocence went to die. The stories from old veterans who had seen the Mexican War painted it in shades of both valor and agony. Yet no tale, however vivid, could truly capture what lay ahead. One morning, just before sunrise, Elias walked to the edge of the orchard and climbed the split rail fence. The fog was low, curling through the branches like smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, lonely and proud. He breathed in deeply, letting the scent of dew, soil, and distant chimney smoke fill his lungs. This place, this quiet, life, was all he had ever known. But it was slipping, slowly, like water through cupped hands. By the end of that week, the official word had come. Volunteers were to be assembled at the county seat within the month, No conscription yet, but the pressure was mounting. Neighbors eyed one another with veiled judgment. Who would go willingly, and who would hang back? Among the young, there was a feverish sort of pride in the air, wrapped in songs, pledges, and the glint of polished boots. But for Elias, it was not glory that beckoned. It was something else. Something quieter and deeper. A pull he couldn't quite name. Was it duty? Was it fear of regret? Or simply the yearning to understand the shape of the world beyond his fields? He did not know. He only knew that change had come to Bell Hollow, not with a cannon's roar, but with a whisper. And that whisper had found its way into his heart. The courthouse in the county seat of Elmsford stood like an old sentinel in the town's heart, its brick facade streaked with moss, its steeple casting a long shadow over the square. Beneath its weathered steps, on a morning sweet with honeysuckle and heat, a queue of young men formed. They came in boots that had seen ploughfields, coats passed down through brothers, and faces that still held more boy than man. Among them stood Elias Calhoun, a folded paper tucked in his pocket, and the weight of quiet decision settled upon his shoulders. It had taken only days after the call for volunteers before he made up his mind. Not from the shouting pride of his neighbors, nor the lean glint of patriotism, but from a silence that had followed him to bed each night, an ache, unspoken, that he would never understand the world if he did not first walk into it. And so, before dawn, with the rooster not yet crowing and the hearth fire still coals, he had kissed his mother's brow, left a note for his father, and walked the 12 miles to Elmsford alone. Now, as the line inched forward beneath the courthouse eaves, the morning sun climbing, he found his hands sweating and his breath shallow. The boys around him jostled with nervous energy. Some cracked jokes, others whispered prayers. A few already wore makeshift uniforms, grey coats stitched by mothers and sweethearts, brass buttons polished until they shone like coins. Elias wore only his Sunday shirt and the courage he had borrowed from somewhere deep inside. Inside the courthouse, the recruiting table was a simple wooden desk set beneath a tall window. 2 men sat behind it, one with spectacles and a stern expression, the other a grizzled captain with a tobacco-stained beard and a ledger thick as a family Bible. Names were called, questions asked, age, health, prior experience with firearms, a trembling nod, a stammered, "Yes, sir," a hesitant step forward. When Elias's name was called, it echoed strangely in the room, like it didn't quite belong in a place so solemn. He stepped forward, heart knocking against his ribs like it wanted out. The spectacles man looked him over and said nothing for a moment, then asked the questions. Elias answered as best he could. 17 years, yes, healthy, no prior service. Had fired his father's hunting rifle plenty of times. Was ready to serve, if they'd have him. The captain scribbled something in the ledger and nodded. "Step forward. Sign your name." Elias's hand reached for the quill before his mind had caught up. The paper before him was thick, slightly yellowed, the ink dark and bleeding at the edges. At the top, in elegant calligraphy, were the words, Confederate States Army, volunteer enlistment form. Below that, the lines of personal information, commitments, duration of service. And then, at the bottom, the signature line. He paused. For a heartbeat, he simply stood there, staring. To sign this paper was to step through a doorway that would not open the same way again. It would be to cross a threshold that his childhood could never follow. Behind him were the sounds of boots shuffling, the creak of the old wood floor, and the distant call of a morning bell. Ahead, silence. And then he moved. He bent, gripped the quill tightly, and wrote in careful strokes, Elias Franklin Calhoun. The ink bled slightly, as if the page absorbed his name with hunger. A strange calm came over him, not joy, not dread. Something softer, like the quiet after the last leaf has fallen in autumn. Outside, after being handed a small folded slip confirming his place in the county regiment, Elias sat on the courthouse steps and looked up at the sky. It was a deep, unbroken blue, and the sun now warmed his back. Around him, boys laughed and called to one another, clapping shoulders and making grand promises. But Elias said nothing. He simply watched the clouds drift, wondering if they looked the same over Washington, over Richmond, over places he'd never seen. Later that afternoon, he found a bench by the general store and pulled from his coat a scrap of paper and a charcoal stub. He began to write to his mother, slowly and with care. "Dearest Mamma, I hope this letter finds you well. I signed today. I did not do so lightly. I know you are scared. I am too, though I will not let it show. I promise to write as often as I am able. Tell Annabelle I will think of her singing when the days grow long. Tell Father, well, tell him I will do my best to make him proud. With love always, Elias." He folded the note and handed it to the postmaster, who knew his family, and nodded solemnly. "Your mama's strong," the old man said. "Stronger than most." That evening, Elias sat alone on the edge of a quiet field just outside town. The sky was painted in soft lavender and peach, the day gently laying itself to rest. Crickets had begun their slow chorus. He watched the fireflies blink on and off, their silent light dancing like old magic. And in his hand, he held the enlistment slip, now creased and smudged, a token of the moment when boyhood had slipped quietly out of reach. He didn't feel brave, he didn't feel bold, but he felt present, truly awake in a way he never had before. He had signed his name, not with dreams of glory, but with a hope that somehow, by walking into the storm, he might one day understand what it meant to live. And though the world around him still slept in peace, somewhere in the distance, the whisper of war grew louder. The day Elias returned home, the hills were beginning to turn green again, their winter hush giving way to the quiet stirrings of spring. The fields around Bell Hollow had not yet been planted, but the earth was waking. The bees buzzed lazily near the blossoms, and the distant hum of frogs filled the dusk. Life, as it often did, moved onward without asking permission. His boots were dirtier than when he had left, the soles worn thin from the march back. In his coat pocket was the single strip of paper confirming his enlistment, proof that he was no longer just a boy from the Carolina hills, but a soldier in the making. The paper crinkled every time he moved, like a reminder that something sacred had been altered. The farmhouse came into view beneath a wash of golden light. The windows glowed with the warm invitation of firelight, and the scent of cornbread drifted on the breeze. It was almost cruel, how unchanged it all looked, as if the world inside had not trembled with the thought of his absence. His mother opened the door before he could knock. She must have heard the crunch of his boots on the path, or perhaps she had simply been waiting. Her apron was dusted with flour, and her hair, usually tied tight, hung in soft curls down her back. She did not weep. She only held him. It was a long embrace, the kind that says everything words cannot reach. Elias stood still in her arms, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender soap and wood smoke. He had not realized how much he had missed it, how much of his strength was built from these small comforts. Annabelle came running down the stairs, her braid swinging behind her. She laughed and threw her arms around his waist. "You're a soldier now," she declared, beaming up at him with innocent awe. "Not yet," Elias replied gently. "Soon." They sat at supper together that night, the table full of warmth. His father spoke little but watched Elias closely. The man's face was lined not with age, but with labour, and his hands, so strong and worn, rested still upon the wood. At last, he nodded once, a subtle gesture of respect that meant more than 100 spoken words. "I reckon you've made your choice," he said. "You go. You do it right. Don't bring shame on this house, and don't forget who you are." "I won't," Elias said. They did not speak of fear, nor of death, nor of the letters that might come in the night. It was not the way of their family. But as the candles burned low and Annabel dozed in her chair, his mother reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "When you go," she whispered, "you take this place with you. You take the light of this table and the songs of the trees and the way the river sounds after a storm. You take it all, Elias. And you, bring it back." He nodded, unable to trust his voice. The days that followed were a flurry of quiet preparations. There were no brass bands or parades in Bell Hollow, just careful hands sewing buttons, sharpening old knives, and mending boots that had long since given up hope of travel. His mother made him a satchel of thick cotton and packed it with dried fruit, biscuits, and a handkerchief embroidered with his initials. Annabel gifted him a charm she had made from twine and an acorn shell. "You keep it in your pocket," she said, "for luck." The morning he was to leave, the sky was heavy, with grey clouds, and a mist clung low to the ground. Elias stood in his room for a long time, looking at the space he had always known. The small bed, the shelf of worn books, the window where he had once watched fireflies dance like lanterns. He touched the wooden frame, tracing the grain with his fingers. He descended the stairs slowly. His mother met him by the door and helped him fasten his coat. His father gave him a flask filled with well water from the spring behind the barn. "It'll taste like home," he said. And then there was nothing left to do. They walked with him to the edge of the orchard. Beyond that point, the road curved, out of sight, leading toward Elmsford and the gathering point for his unit. The trees stood silent, their bare branches reaching upward like the arms of old men in prayer. The air smelled of damp earth and old leaves. Elias turned to them one last time. His mother touched his face, and his father placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Annabel clung to his coat, then let go. He stepped onto the road, and he did not look back until he had reached the bend. From there, he saw them still standing together, small beneath the trees. His mother raised her hand in farewell. He raised his in return, and then the road took him. With each step, he felt the weight of home settling deeper into his chest, not as a burden, but as a compass. Every memory, every warm glance, every lesson was packed into the folds of his coat. The hearth behind him glowed, not with fire, but with all that made him who he was. And though the road ahead was long, and the war not yet begun in earnest, Elias walked forward with the soft, steady strength of one who carries love in his pocket. The road was not paved with glory. It was dust and stone, winding through woods that whispered and fields gone fallow. Each step stirred the dry earth, a soft puff that clung to boots and breeches alike. Elias Calhoun, now formally enlisted, marched in rhythm with a dozen others. Boys turned recruits, green as spring's first shoots, and just as uncertain. Their unit was called the 3rd Carolina Volunteers, a name that sounded grander than it felt. They were assigned to muster in a clearing just past the outskirts of Elmsford, where a few canvas tents had been erected, flapping in the late March breeze. Some men had rifles slung over their shoulders, others merely walked with hands stuffed into their coat pockets, uncertain what to do with them. Elias had been given a knapsack and a length of rope. His rifle would come later, when the armory cart arrived. For now, he carried bread, a canteen, a blanket, and his own silence. The first days of marching were more meandering than military. There were few orders, fewer uniforms, and little sense of command. The captains themselves, appointed by vote more than experience, were still learning how to give commands with the proper weight. But the men marched anyway, following the old road southward, toward where the army was said to be forming in earnest. Each morning, they rose before dawn, the frost still clinging to the low brush. A bugle call, slightly off tune, would stir the camp, and fires would be kindled with trembling hands. The men washed their faces in cold creek water, wrapped their coats tighter, and began again. Elias took to walking near the middle of the column, where talk was softer and the jostling less severe. Around him, voices rose and fell in bursts of laughter, storytelling, and idle speculation. "Think we'll see Richmond?" someone asked on the third day. "I heard General Lee might be there. I heard he walks with a sword so sharp it cuts the wind. I heard he don't walk at all, rides a white horse that never tires." The stories passed the time, even if they frayed at the edges with exaggeration. Elias listened but spoke little. He preferred the rhythm of his own breath, the steady crunch of his boots against the road, the swaying motion of the trees as they marched past. He carried with him a letter from his mother, folded neatly inside his satchel. He had not read it yet. He wanted to wait, perhaps for a night when homesickness weighed too heavily, or when the ache of uncertainty needed the balm of her voice on paper. At night, the men gathered around fires that smoked more than they burned. Salt pork sizzled on, tin plates, and coffee boiled in battered kettles. Songs were sung, out of tune, but full of heart, and sometimes a fiddle would emerge from someone's pack, drawing forth melodies that wrapped around them like wool. Elias often found himself staring into the flames, watching the way the embers rose and disappeared into the dark. He thought of home then, of his mother's kitchen, of Annabelle's songs, of his father's silence. He wondered how many sons from how many towns were out here now, all walking the same dust-covered roads. One afternoon, as they crested a small rise, the company came upon a hamlet called Tallow Creek. It was little more than a general store, a church, and a scattering of houses with shutters pulled tight. But the townsfolk emerged anyway, offering apples and cornbread, warm water, and soft encouragement. Children waved from porches, and old women handed out small tokens, buttons, ribbons, sprigs of dried lavender. Elias received a button carved from bone, pressed into his hand by a woman who smelled of tobacco and rosewater. "For luck," she said, eyes wet. "For the road ahead." That evening they camped in a field of wild mustard, its yellow blooms glowing in the firelight. Elias lay back on his blanket, staring at the sky. The stars above seemed unchanged, ancient and unmoved by the affairs of men. They blinked down quietly, as if to say, "You are smaller than you think, but no less cherished." It was during this stillness that a voice beside him whispered, "Ever been far from home before?" Elias turned. The speaker was a lanky boy with a crooked smile and a straw-coloured beard that looked more like fuzz than hair. "Name's Silas," he added. "Elias," he replied softly. They didn't speak much more that night, but Elias found comfort in the presence of another who, like him, seemed more thoughtful than loud, more watchful than wild. The following day brought rain. A soft drizzle at first, then heavier, soaking their coats and turning the road to mud. Boots sank. Curses rose. The fires sputtered that night, and the tents leaked, but still they marched. It was during this dreary evening that Elias finally unfolded his mother's letter, seeking her voice in the growing distance. It read, "My son, I miss you more than I can bear, but I am proud, not because you march to war, but because you do it with a quiet heart. Remember to eat when you can, sleep when you must, and always keep a piece of home in your thoughts. I light a candle for you each night, and pray it glows long enough for you to find your way back to us. With all my love, Mama." Elias folded the letter again and pressed it to his chest. The road ahead was long, the skies uncertain. But he walked on, not for battle, not for glory, but for something deeper. The dust on his boots was no longer a nuisance. It was a sign that he was moving, changing, becoming, and somewhere down that winding path, his story waited to unfold. Morning in the soldiers' camp did not arrive with trumpets, nor with the triumphant glare of sunlight bursting through silk drapes. It crept in softly, almost shyly, like the first notes of a hymn whispered through fog. The stars would still linger, pale and blinking, as the sky lightened to a dull pewter grey. And then, without drama, the day would begin. Elias Calhoun came to know these mornings with intimate familiarity. Their regiment had now been assigned to a more permanent encampment near the banks of the broad river, where the trees stood like watchmen, and the mist clung low to the ground, as though reluctant to let the earth go. It was a place both quiet and cold. The air smelled of wet bark, old ash, and the faint tang of sweat from the bodies that slept too closely, curled beneath threadbare blankets and wool coats. The bugle's cry came just before dawn, a thin, wavering note that cut through the hush. Elias would blink awake each time with a start, his breath puffing white in the chill. Around him, the groans and rustles of the other men began. Boots thumped against the ground, fires cracked to life again, and curses floated like incense into the morning air. There was no elegance in the rising of soldiers, only the groggy ritual of pulling on stiff boots, shaking out damp clothes, and clutching one's sides against the bite of the breeze. Elias always took a moment to sit upright and breathe before standing, a habit he had begun since the first morning, when the cold had made him dizzy, and the sudden shouts of officers had nearly made him vomit. Once upright, the morning labours began. The fires had to be fed, twigs snapped, and dry leaves gathered in bundles. Water had to be fetched from the river, its surface glazed with thin sheets of ice. Tin cups were dipped with careful fingers, and those who could afford the patience would heat the water over coals to make a weak tea or to soften the last crumbs of bread. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was seldom more than salted meat or leftover cornmeal. Elias learned quickly to chew slowly, savouring every mouthful, and to keep a sliver of hardtack tucked in his pocket for later. Hunger, he realised, was not a storm that arrived all at once, but a steady drizzle that followed you wherever you marched. By the time the sun crested the treetops, the men were formed into ranks, bleary-eyed, rumpled, but standing. Their captain, a stocky man named Barrett, with a deep voice and a hawk-like stare, would walk the line and bark the day's orders. Drill was to begin immediately. No time wasted. War, he reminded them, was not won by sleep or sentiment. Drill consumed the morning hours. The open meadow became their proving ground. Under the guidance of grizzled sergeants, the men practiced formations, manoeuvres, and the precise timing of musket fire. "Load! Aim! Fire!" came the cry again and again, until the phrase echoed in Elias's dreams. Powder, ball, ramrod, prime. Over and over, Elias's hands became blistered from the repetition. His fingers ached from gripping the weapon, from snapping to attention, from holding the same stance beneath an unforgiving sky. But with each passing day, the motions grew smoother. Not easy, never easy, but familiar, like the shaping of stone by water. Silas, who had become his closest companion, in the camp, often turned the drills into whispered commentary. "If I die," he muttered one morning as they stood in formation, "tell my kin I perished nobly, of boredom." Elias cracked a rare smile, though he did not break his stance. After drills came duties. Some men gathered wood, others dug latrines, cleaned rifles, or stitched torn clothing with hands too clumsy for needlework. Elias was often sent to fetch supplies from the quartermaster, a cantankerous man with a beard like moss and a ledger that he guarded like scripture. When duties were finished, the midday meal was served. Thin stew if luck was with them, more often beans or potatoes. Elias would eat slowly, savouring the heat more than the taste. There was comfort in the simple rhythm of spoon to mouth, in the warmth that spread through his chest after each bite. It was during these quiet meals that talk turned to home. The men spoke of farms and sisters, of sweethearts and dogs, of favourite trees and half-forgotten smells. Elias listened more than he spoke, storing each tale like a borrowed coat for the cold nights. And though the routines of a soldier's morning were often hard, tedious and thankless, there was something grounding in them. In a world where the future was unknown and letters from home could change everything, the constancy of routine gave the men something to hold on to. In the stillness before evening drill, Elias would often walk to the river's edge. There, beneath the bare-limbed sycamores, he would sit on a smooth stone and watch the current flow. The water was always moving, always whispering. He would take out his mother's letter, smooth its creases, and read it again. Sometimes twice. It became his ritual, his tether. And as the last rays of light filtered through the canopy, he would rise and return to camp. Boots caked in mud, coat pulled tight, rifle slung across his back. A soldier, perhaps, but still a son, still a brother, still a boy with dreams folded quietly beneath his uniform. The mornings would come again, as they always did, grey and cold and sacred. And Elias would rise each time, a little stronger, a little wearier, but always walking forward. To the outside world, the life of a soldier may have seemed thrilling. Marches through unknown country, skirmishes whispered about in smoky taverns, the bold clatter of sabres under sunlight. But for Elias Calhoun, and for most of the young men beside him, soldiering was a rhythm of repetition, not of roaring battles, but of days marked by the steady pulse of drills and the unyielding beat of the regimental drum. The drum was an old thing, its skin darkened by time and stained by years of weather and sweat. It belonged to a boy named Thomas Pike, no older than 15, with freckles scattered across his nose like spilled grain. He was too young to carry a rifle, too light to wield a sword, but his hands knew the language of rhythm. Every morning, as the sky shifted from violet to silver, Thomas would lift his sticks and begin the day's call. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, 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 tap. The sound stirred the camp from slumber like a mother waking her children. It was not harsh, not angry, but persistent, enough to rouse even the weariest from their blankets. To Elias, that drumbeat came to symbolize more than schedule. It was a signal that life was continuing, that order still stood in the face of chaos. After breakfast, after the fire pits cooled and the first stretch of sunlight touched the frost-covered leaves, the drills would begin. They gathered in ranks, muskets at their sides, eyes bleary and boots still stiff from the damp. The field near their camp had been trampled into a flat, muddy plain, bordered by brush and young pine trees. It bore the scars of endless footfalls, ruts where men had marched in lines again and again, perfecting the same steps with grim determination. "Line up," barked Sergeant Millen, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "You there, shoulders back. If I wanted a pack of lazy limbs, I'd have enlisted scarecrows." Elias found his place near the center of the line, beside Silas and two boys from the coastal counties, Micah and Reuben, who never stopped arguing about the best kind of tobacco. The commands came quickly, always the same. "Forward march. Halt. Right. Face. Left face. Shoulder arms. Present arms." The muskets moved as one mostly. At first the lines were ragged. Men stumbled. Feet tripped over uneven ground. Shoulders bumped. But as the weeks passed, something remarkable began to happen. Their movements grew smooth, like a tide that learned the rhythm of the shore. They moved not as individuals, but as a single body, shaped by the same invisible will. Still, it was exhausting work. The sun did not wait for their drills to end. It climbed higher each hour, turning morning mist into choking humidity. Sweat pooled beneath their collars, ran down their backs, soaked into their socks. Blisters bloomed and burst. Elias's hands were covered in calluses. The skin along his right thumb rubbed raw by the musket's stock. But they persisted. During breaks, men would collapse into the grass, panting and laughing and swearing. Silas took to crafting short songs about their instructors, sung under his breath so as not to earn extra laps around the field. Oh, Sergeant Millen's got no heart. He traded it for boots. He eats young dreams for breakfast time and drills us out our roots. Elias would smile at the verses, but never repeated them aloud. He had begun to understand that discipline, however cruel it seemed, was the thread holding them all together. Without it, they were simply boys with guns. With it, they were something else entirely, something steadier, if not yet strong. One morning, after a particularly punishing series of maneuvers, Captain Barrett stood before the company and addressed them without his usual bark. "You may think these drills are for show," he said, voice low and earnest, "but they are for your lives. When the bullets fly, you will have no time to think. Your feet, your hands, your breath, they must remember even when your mind forgets." He paused, scanning their faces. "The enemy does not care for your fear. The enemy does not wait for you to be ready. So we prepare now, while we still have time." The men were silent, even Silas. After that day, the drills took on a different tone. Not less difficult, but somehow more vital. Elias moved with renewed focus, adjusting the way he held his weapon, listening to the rhythm of the commands, like a musician to a metronome. In the evenings, when the sun bled into the tree line and the air cooled, Thomas would play softer rhythms, on the drum, slow rolls that settled the camp into quiet. Elias often sat near the edge of the firelight, polishing his musket, listening. The sound of the drum was no longer just noise. It had become a heartbeat, a reminder that in this strange, new life, rhythm and order were their only true allies. One evening, Thomas caught Elias watching him. "Do you think it matters?" the boy asked, not looking up. "What?" "The drum. The beat. Does it change anything?" Elias thought a moment. Then he nodded. "It keeps us together." Thomas gave a small smile, then returned to his practice, tapping out a steady rhythm, into the dusk, and so the days passed, each one a verse in a song composed of movement and noise, silence and sweat. Through drills and drum beats, they became soldiers not through combat, but through repetition. Not through fire, but through form. The war had not yet touched them with its violence, but it was there, in the precision of their steps, the ache in their shoulders, the cadence of their mornings, waiting, in the heart of the camp, long after the drills had ceased and the fires had begun to crackle with evening's hush. There came a different kind of ritual, one not barked from an officer's lungs or measured by a sergeant's step. It was the quiet ceremony of letters. Words from home, folded with care, passed hand to hand like sacred offerings. For Elias Calhoun, these letters became lifelines. The first post rider arrived just after supper on a Monday, his coat streaked with mud and his mare's flanks slick with sweat. He rode into camp with little fanfare, but as he slowed, a hush rippled through the men. Voices softened, conversations paused. Even the clatter of pots seemed to quiet as the courier dismounted, pulled a leather satchel from his side, and began calling names. Micah Boone, Reuben Carter, Elias Calhoun. Elias's heart jumped at the sound. He stepped forward, boots crunching in the dirt, and took the envelope with both hands. It was soft from the journey, its corners slightly bent. The ink faded at the edges. But he knew the handwriting at once. Looping, precise, gentle. His mother's hand. He returned to his bedroll and sat beneath the crooked limb of a pine tree, where the light from the nearby fire reached just enough to read by. He broke the wax seal with careful fingers and unfolded the letter like a map, as though it might lead him home again. "My dearest Elias, we are all well. Your father still says little, but watches the post road each morning, just in case. Annabelle has taken to drawing you pictures, one of which I have tucked into this envelope. She misses your stories at bedtime. The hens are laying more now that the frost is gone. I've planted early turnips, and the peach tree has blossoms already. Spring comes gently this year. I wish you could see it. I think of you each day, especially when the wind moves through the trees. I pray you're warm, well-fed, and watchful. Keep your feet dry, your letters coming, and your heart steady. With love that knows no measure, Mama." Elias read it twice, then a third time. He held the paper to his chest, closed his eyes, and breathed deeply, as if he could draw her scent from the page. It smelled faintly of lavender. He wasn't the only one. Around the campfire, letters were being read aloud or quietly, laughed over or cried into. Some men folded their missives and kissed them. Others tucked them into breast pockets like relics. One boy, who hadn't received a letter, simply sat with a forced smile and whittled a stick into a spiral. Elias caught his eye and offered a piece of biscuit in silent companionship. Writing back was its own tender labor. Elias would wait for the moon to rise, for the camp to still, and then draw out his worn scrap of charcoal and a page from the quartermaster's notebook. He would hunch over his knees, elbows braced, and begin slowly. "Dear Mama, thank you for your letter. It means more than I can say. The camp is cold but bearable. I have boots and a coat. The food is plain, but it fills the stomach. I miss your cooking more than I miss warmth. Silas sends his regards. He is from Greenville and plays the fiddle. He has helped the long days pass more gently. We drill often. My hands are sore, but I am learning fast. I will not shame you. I promise. The river here is wide and fast. I sit near it in the evenings and think of the creek behind our orchard. Strange how even water can carry memory. Tell Annabelle to keep drawing. I have her picture in my coat. It keeps me brave. All my love. Elias." He folded the letter with precision, sealing it with a thin thread from his blanket and marking it carefully. Calhoun Farm, Bell Hollow, Carolina. Mail was collected once a week. The outgoing letters were placed in a wooden crate near the supply tent. Elias always walked there slowly, as if the weight of his thoughts might change by the time he reached it. But he never rewrote his letters. Once they were folded, they stayed that way. Over time, the exchange of letters became a rhythm as sacred as the morning drills. It gave the soldiers something to measure time by, something other than the rise and fall of the sun or the echo of footsteps on parade ground. Letters bore the scent of home, the warmth of memory. They reminded the men of who they were beyond their uniforms. Sons, brothers, sweethearts, husbands. They were pieces of a life paused, a whisper that the world had not forgotten them. Elias began to treasure these moments more than any others. After drill, after supper, after the last bit of daylight faded, he would sometimes ask Silas or Micah to read their letters aloud. It became a kind of shared comfort, like passing a warm cup on a cold night. One evening, Silas read a letter from his sister. "You always hated winter, but I've kept your scarf in my room just the same. I pretend sometimes that you're home and just asleep in the barn. Mama made stew last night. She burned it again, but no one told her. We all just laughed and ate it anyway." The men chuckled, and for a few moments, the war felt far away as the fire dwindled and the stars blinked to life overhead. Elias lay back and stared at the sky. Somewhere beyond the woods, beyond the dark, home still waited, still believed, still wrote, and so long as letters came, folded with care, soaked in memory, he would never be truly lost. The morning of their first battle began like all the others, soft, grey, and quiet. A mist lay upon the fields like a second skin, draped gently over every blade of grass, every weary tent, every rifle stacked neatly in rows. Birds stirred in, the hedgerows and the breath of the camp rose like smoke into the slow-breaking dawn. Elias Calhoun awoke to the smell of damp wool and the low murmur of voices. Voices not loud or laughing, but hushed and slow, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. He rubbed his eyes, pulled on his coat, and sat for a long moment before rising. The orders had come in the evening prior. Their unit was to move forward, closer to the front. There had been skirmishes already, brief flashes of contact along the river, but this was to be the first true engagement, where lines would be drawn, muskets fired in volleys, and men would fall not in practice, but in finality. As Elias stood beside the fire, warming his hands over the flicker of flame, Silas approached. He carried his rifle slung across his shoulder, a biscuit clenched in one hand. "You sleep?" Silas asked. Elias nodded, though he hadn't. Not fully. Dreams had come in broken pieces. Marching feet, his sister's voice, the sound of distant thunder that was not made by storms. Funny, Silas said, how you can train for weeks and still not feel ready. I don't think we're meant to feel ready, Elias replied. Just steady. Breakfast was eaten with little appetite. Bread went half chewed, coffee cooled untouched. Some men sat sharpening bayonets with slow, meticulous hands. Others simply stared ahead, eyes fixed on the fog. Reuben was reading a passage from a small, worn Bible. Micah muttered a hymn under his breath, barely audible. As the sun climbed behind the mist, the order came to form ranks. Elias stood with his unit near the tree line, his rifle clutched tight. The weight of it, once unfamiliar, had become a strange comfort. The stock was warm from his grip, the barrel clean. The flint checked twice before the line was called forward. Then came the drum. Not the gentle evening rhythm Thomas used to soothe the camp, but a firm and deliberate roll. Each beat seemed to press into the earth, calling the men to awareness. They marched slowly at first, the field stretching before them like a cathedral floor, wide, sacred, and still. Beyond the rise ahead, the enemy waited. No faces could yet be seen, only the echo of preparation, the occasional neigh of a horse, the clang of metal, the brief silhouette of movement beyond the tree line. Then it came, the first cannon's roar. It shattered the silence like glass, the sound rolling over the field in a wave of violence that seemed to shake the trees themselves. Elias felt it in his bones, deep and primal. A scream, not of voice, but of steel and fire and the end of stillness. Smoke bloomed from the ridge across the way, rising in thick spirals that blurred the line between sky and ground. The second cannon fired before the first echo had died. But the men flinched, instinctively ducking, though the ball struck somewhere far to the left, kicking up soil and stones in a vicious spray. "Hold line," came the cry from Captain Barrett. "Stand firm." Elias's hands trembled, but he tightened his grip. Around him the men began to load. Powder, ball, ram, prime. The drill they had practiced 1,000 times now felt both absurdly familiar and terrifyingly real. Elias followed the steps with deliberate care, each motion feeling slower than the last, though time seemed to blur around him. Then came the musket fire, from the other side first, sharp and cracking, like twigs breaking, in rapid succession. The hiss of balls through the air followed. One struck the ground not far from Elias's foot, sending a spray of dirt against his trousers. Another passed so close to his ear he felt the heat of its wake. "Fire!" Barrett shouted. Their line responded in thunderous unison. Elias raised, his musket, aimed and fired. The kick against his shoulder was familiar, but the feeling afterward was not. There was no target he could see, no figure to mark, only smoke, sound, and movement. The recoil echoed in his bones. "Reload!" The process began again, hands now slick with sweat, powder spilled, mouths dry with fear. Silas was beside him, firing again, his jaw tight, eyes wide but focused. Reuben was muttering the same verse, over and over. "Though I walk through the valley," over and over, like a chant. And still, the cannon roared. The ground vibrated with each blast. Men screamed, some in command, some in pain. One boy fell just 3 paces ahead, clutching his chest. Blood seeped through his coat like ink on parchment. Elias could not look away, not at first. The boy's eyes were open. Then they were not. "Keep moving," came the cry. Forward they went. They crossed a ditch, muddy and slick. Elias stumbled, caught himself, and climbed the other side. More fire, more smoke. The world had narrowed to sound, touch, and flashes of light. He could no longer hear individual voices, only the roar of gunpowder, the whistle of lead, and the dull thud of bodies meeting earth. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, there came a lull. The firing slowed. The smoke began to lift. Shouts turned to commands. The enemy had pulled back, or so it seemed. The field lay strewn with broken shapes, some still, some moving, others groaning in that awful, inhuman way that no storybook had ever described. Elias stood, breathing hard, his rifle lowered. His hands shook. He looked to Silas, who nodded silently, a tear tracing a line down his soot-stained cheek. They had survived. The first cannon's roar had come and gone, and though they still stood, something inside them had changed. Something that could not be named, only felt. The boy from Bell Hollow was now a soldier. The smoke did not vanish when the cannons fell silent. It lingered, heavy and stubborn, clinging to the trees like mourning cloth, curling through the grass in slow, choking tendrils. It seeped into every fold of the world, dulling colours, softening sound, turning even the most vivid into shades of grey. Elias Calhoun stood upon the slope of a shallow ridge, his musket held loosely in one hand, and watched as the world drifted into silence. His ears rang with the echo of muskets and shouting, ghost sounds that had not yet left his body. Around him, men moved slowly, some in shock, some limping, others kneeling beside those who would not rise again. The ridge had been a place of charge and defence, the clash of two lines pressing against each other like storm fronts. They had gained it only an hour before, forcing the opposing unit back toward the river bend. The price had been high. The slope was dotted with shapes. Some curled inwards as though sleeping, others sprawled unnaturally, arms flung wide. Elias did not yet know the names of all the men who had fallen. Some he'd never spoken to. But there was one he recognized, the boy who had once lent him a clean sock and laughed about it for days. His name had been Jonah. Elias remembered the way he always whistled in the morning, as if every day might be worth singing for. Now Jonah lay at the foot of a tree, eyes open to the pale sky. Elias turned away. Smoke drifted past his face, stinging his eyes. It carried with it the scent of powder, blood, and churned earth. Every breath was thick, as though the air itself grieved. Silas found him near a toppled cart, his coat torn at the shoulder, face smeared with soot. "They pulled back," he said, his voice hoarse. "But they'll return. They always do." Elias nodded. He had no words. His body ached in places he didn't know could ache. His hands were blistered from the heat of the musket barrel, and his shoulder throbbed from the recoil. Still, he was whole, still standing. Around them, the wounded were being gathered. Those who could walk, walked. Those who could not, were carried or rolled onto stretchers made from spare coats and branches. The moans filled the stillness like low wind through tall grass. Reuben limped past, his leg wrapped hastily in a strip of shirt, his jaw clenched in pain. "They'll bury them tonight," he murmured. "They always do it quick. Less time for the smell to settle." The words hit Elias like a blow. Burial. Already. But of course, it had to be so. The dead were too many to leave, too fragile to wait. As dusk began to seep into the smoke, officers called for volunteers to assist with the task. Elias stepped forward before he had time to think. He and Silas worked in silence. They dug shallow graves with whatever tools they could find. Shovels, bayonets, even bare hands. The soil was damp and resistant. For each body, they laid a small stone or a broken twig cross. No names, just memory, folded into earth. As they worked, Elias kept thinking of Jonah, of his whistling, of the sock he had loaned him. It seemed strange now, almost holy, how something so small could feel so significant. He whispered a quiet goodbye as he lowered him into the ground. By the time they finished, the stars had begun to show, dim at first, then clearer as the smoke thinned. The fires in camp burned low, more for comfort than warmth. Men huddled in pairs or threes, blankets pulled high, some weeping quietly, others staring into nothing. Elias sat with Silas near a stump, their hands caked in soil, their faces streaked with ash. "I thought it would feel different," Silas said after a long while. "What?" "Surviving." Elias looked at him, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "Feels like being left behind." They said no more. The ridge was quiet now. The cannon's roar had faded into memory, the muskets gone still, but the smoke remained. It wrapped itself around the night, curling into dreams, pressing into lungs. Elias lay down beneath the stars, pulling his blanket tight. He thought of Bell Hollow, of the sound the trees made after rain, of Annabelle's laugh. He reached into his coat and pulled out her little acorn charm. It was warm from his body heat. He held it in his palm like a prayer. He did not sleep deeply that night. Few did. The dreams that came were fragmented and strange, of running through fields that bled into rivers, of voices calling from beneath the soil. At one point, he awoke with a start, certain he had heard someone whisper his name. But there was no one there, just the ridge, silent and watching, and the smoke, always the smoke, curling through the branches like the ghost of the day that had passed. Not all wounds bled. Not all pain could be wrapped in linen or soothed with whiskey. In the days following the battle on the ridge, Elias Calhoun began to learn that the body was not the only thing that could be broken. There were fractures in the soul, cracks in the quiet places, where no surgeon's hand could reach. The regiment did not move for several days. They lingered near the ridge, tending the wounded, burying the dead, repairing what gear had survived. The smell of smoke still clung to everything. Blankets, coats, even hair, and the air was thick with the silence of men who had seen too much, too soon. Elias moved through these days like a ghost. He rose when the bugle sounded. He ate when food was handed to him. He cleaned his musket, polished his boots, answered roll calls. But his thoughts were far away, adrift in a fog that no wind could clear. The images returned in flashes. The boy named Jonah, eyes open to the sky. The arc of smoke from a cannon's mouth, the sickening thud of a body hitting earth. They came unbidden, even in daylight, even with open eyes. At night, it was worse. Sleep came in fitful bursts, haunted by dreams where the battlefield never ended. Sometimes Elias would sit upright in the dark, breath ragged, clutching his blanket as though it might anchor him. Other times, he would simply lie awake, staring at the stars through the slits of his tent, waiting for morning. He did not speak of it, not to Silas, not to Reuben, not even to the chaplain who walked the camp each evening, murmuring prayers into the firelight. Most of the men didn't speak of it either. Instead, they found other ways to carry their weight. Some drank, sharing stolen whiskey from battered flasks. Others sang more loudly than before, as though trying to drown out memory with melody. A few grew angry, snapping at orders, cursing the mud, throwing punches over imagined slights, and some grew quiet, like Elias. Their voices folded inward. Their eyes stared too long at nothing. One afternoon, while cleaning his rifle by the riverbank, Elias noticed Silas watching him. "You ain't said more than 10 words in 3 days," Silas said, his tone soft. Elias didn't answer right away. He ran the cloth along the musket's barrel again. Slowly, carefully. "I still see it," he said finally. "All of it," Silas nodded. "Yeah." They sat in silence for a long time, the sound of the river whispering around them. "You know, what gets me?" Silas said after a while. "Jonah. He talked about going home next spring. Said he was going to fix his uncle's mill. He had it all planned. He thought we'd have time." Elias's throat tightened. He swallowed hard. "We all thought that," he said. The breeze rustled through the reeds. Birds flitted through the trees above, indifferent to the sorrows below. Nature Elias thought, was too old to mourn for men. Later that evening, the chaplain, an older man with silver in his beard and kind eyes, called for a gathering near the largest fire. Some came, others didn't. Elias found himself drawn to the circle, if only to sit among voices again. The chaplain did not preach. He didn't offer grand words of solace or fiery reminders of honor. Instead, he spoke simply, his voice like a lullaby. "There are wounds," he said, "that no one can see, and they are the heaviest. They ache not in the flesh, but in the spirit, and it is no sin to feel them." He paused, looking around the circle. "You do not have to carry them alone." Elias felt something shift then, not a great lifting, but a slight loosening, like the first thaw of spring in frozen soil. That night, he wrote a letter. "Dear Mama, I am alive. That is the best I can offer today. We had our first battle. It was loud and long and full of smoke. I wish I could say more, but the words do not come. I think of Jonah, who you wouldn't know, but who was good. I think of the sky above the ridge, and the way it never changed, even when everything else did. I am tired, but I will keep going. For you, for Annabelle, for the farm. I will come, home. I must. Love always, Elias." He folded the letter with care and placed it in the satchel where the others waited. It felt smaller than the rest, but heavier somehow. In the days that followed, Elias began to talk again. Not much, not often, but enough. He walked with Silas along the riverbank, helped Reuben repair a broken boot heel, shared half a biscuit with Thomas the drummer. He began to remember that laughter, though quieter now, still had a place. He also prayed, not with words, but with presence, sitting beneath the stars, feeling the wind, listening to the river, letting the world speak where his heart could not. And so, the wounds remained. But they no longer bled in silence. They lived alongside him, shadowed and real, stitched, not with thread, but with time and the quiet kindness of others. The field hospital was not a building. It had no walls, no lantern-lit corridors, no beds with linen sheets tucked into corners. It was a cluster of tents pitched hurriedly at the edge of the tree line, their canvas stained with mud and time. Flies swarmed like drifting ash. The scent, sour, sharp, and lingering, hung heavy in the air, the mingling perfume of sweat, blood, whiskey, and rot. Elias Calhoun had walked past it many times, until one morning he did not walk past, but into it. The pain had begun as a dull throb in his side, a soreness he'd attributed to drill or a bad night's sleep. But when the fever came, sudden and unforgiving, and the world began to tilt when he stood, he was ordered to the tents. At first he protested. "It's nothing," he insisted, "just the weather, or bad stew." But his protests did not matter. Captain Barrett had seen too many boys fall from infections they had sworn they could walk off. He sent Elias, with a stern look and a brief nod, the kind that ended discussion. And so, Elias entered the place he had long feared most, not because of what it did, but because of what it meant. The field hospital was where the wounded lay in stillness, where cries came muffled through canvas, and where the line between living and not was drawn as thin as thread. A nurse met him at the entrance, a woman in grey skirts, her sleeves rolled. "Hi," her hands stained but steady. "Sit there," she said, pointing to a cot fashioned from boards and horse blankets. "Shirt off." Her name was Clara, and her voice carried no pretense. She spoke to him as one might to a brother, or a child, directly, but with a gentleness hidden beneath the efficiency. Her hands were cool against his skin as she pressed the side of his abdomen. "Fever's taken hold," she murmured. "Could be nothing. Could be worse. We'll keep you here, just in case." Elias nodded weakly. He felt light-headed, as though his body were floating slightly above the earth. She brought him a tin cup of water, cool and laced with a bitter tincture that burned his tongue, and laid a damp cloth on his brow. Then she moved on, to the next, patient. And the next, her presence weaving through the tent like a thread of calm in a fraying world. Hours passed, then days. Time bent strangely inside the tent. There were no bells, no drills, only the slow movement of light through canvas and the soft groans of those around him. Elias shared the space with half a dozen others, some with bandaged limbs, others with chests rising too shallowly, too slowly. There was a boy across from him, barely 15, red-haired and pale, who had taken a musket ball to the thigh. He cried in his sleep, clutching a rosary made of wooden beads. Beside him, an older man mumbled constantly under his breath, lost in fevered dreams, the war replaying endlessly in his mind. Elias slept when he could, waking often with sweat pooling in the curve of his back, the fever's grip loosening slowly, like winter yielding to spring. Clara returned each day, her apron never clean, her hands never still. She changed bandages, brought broth, read aloud from a psalter when the silence grew too long. She spoke to the wounded not as burdens, but as brothers. "You're strong," she said to Elias one morning, as she pressed her palm to his cheek. "You'll see the outside again soon." He managed a faint smile. "I miss the sky." "You'll find it again," she replied. "It's patient. It waits." On the 5th day, Silas appeared at the tent flap. He ducked inside, carrying a small parcel wrapped in cloth. "You look like a ghost," he said with a smirk. Elias chuckled, though it made his ribs ache. "Feels like I'm halfway to becoming one." "I brought something." Silas set the bundle on his cot. Inside was a biscuit, a stub of cheese, and a folded letter. "From home," he added. "Came this morning." Elias reached for the letter with trembling fingers. His mother's handwriting greeted him like a whisper. "My son, the daffodils have bloomed along the fence. Annabelle has taken to playing school with the chickens. She scolds them for not listening. I dreamed of you last night. You were standing by the river, your boots muddy, but your eyes bright. You smiled. That's all. Come back to us. Mama." Tears slipped down Elias's cheeks without warning. He did not wipe them away. Silas sat beside him, not speaking, just watching the way his friend held the letter, as though it might vanish if he blinked too hard. By the 7th day, Elias's fever had broken. He rose from the cot slowly, his legs unsteady, but his breath stronger. Clara helped him to the entrance of the tent, where he stood blinking in the sunlight like a man reborn. The air was crisp. Birds sang in the trees. The sky, endlessly blue, arched overhead in silent welcome. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting it wash over him. Healing, he realized, was not only of the flesh, it was the slow return of light to the mind, of warmth to the heart. It was standing beneath the sun and remembering that life moved forward. The war was not done. The wounds had not all closed. But for now, he stood, alive, whole, and touched by grace. And for the first time in many days, Elias Calhoun smiled. The night came slowly, as if unsure of its welcome. The sun dipped low beyond the distant ridge, casting long shadows over the camp. The air cooled, brushing soft fingers along the backs of soldiers as they settled into the hush of evening. Fires crackled in rings around the field, small circles of light in an ever-widening dark. It would be the longest night they had known. Word had spread quietly throughout the day. The enemy was massing again. There would be an advance by dawn. The officers moved in murmurs. Orders passed with tight expressions and clipped gestures. Weapons were checked and rechecked, packs repacked, boots laced tighter than ever before. No one shouted, no one sang. It was a different kind of preparation, not of noise, but of silence. Elias Calhoun felt it deep in his bones. The kind of quiet that came before a storm, not of wind and water, but of men and iron. He had heard it once before, on the ridge, but this felt deeper, sharper, a stillness that pierced. He sat beside Silas near a small fire, the flames dancing against the sides of their tin mugs. They sipped what passed for coffee, bitter, weak, and full of grit, but neither complained. The ritual mattered more than the taste. "You think we'll see the morning?" Silas asked, not looking up. Elias paused. He watched a moth flutter near the firelight, then vanish into shadow. "I think we'll see something," he replied. Around them, the camp shifted in low, rhythmic movement. Some men wrote letters. Others stared into flames, lips moving silently. A few knelt in prayer, fingers clasped tightly, shoulders hunched. Every man bore the knowledge that this night might be his last. And yet, none wept. It was not grief they carried, but acceptance, a quiet readiness that no drill could teach. Elias drew his blanket tighter and glanced upward. The stars were bright tonight, clearer than they had been in weeks. They shimmered like scattered salt, cold and ancient. He wondered if Annabelle might be looking up at the same sky, back home in Bell Hollow. He hoped she was dreaming gently, her world still full of songs and sunlight. His thoughts drifted like smoke, turning toward his mother, toward the orchard, the way the peach trees looked in bloom, the sound of frogs at dusk. He wished he could bottle those memories, carry them like a lantern into what lay ahead. Thomas, the drummer boy, wandered past, his small form bundled in a too large coat. He paused beside their fire. "Mind if I sit?" "Course not," Silas said, scooting over. Thomas lowered himself carefully, his drum resting in his lap. He ran his fingers along its rim, tracing the worn edge. "I'm scared," he said simply. Elias looked at him. The boy's freckles were barely visible in the firelight, but his eyes were wide and clear. "Honest." "So are we," Elias said. They sat in silence, the three of them, listening to the fire's low pop and hiss. In the distance, a fiddle began to play, soft, slow notes that rose like mist into the night. It was not a battle hymn or a march, but a lullaby, gentle and mournful. The melody seemed to reach every corner of the camp, wrapping the men in a shared stillness. It was a song for mothers and fields, for goodbyes whispered in the dark. A song that asked nothing, but gave everything. Elias closed his eyes and let it carry him. When he opened them again, the fire had burned lower, and most of the camp was still. Men lay wrapped in blankets, rifles at their sides. The stars had shifted slightly overhead. He didn't know what time it was, only that it was deep in the night. Silas was asleep, head resting against his pack. Thomas had dozed off too, his small hands curled around his drum like it was a pillow. Elias stood slowly, stepping away from the fire. He walked beyond the tents, beyond the outer ring of sentries, until he reached a small rise overlooking the valley, where the next day's battle would likely unfold. It was quiet there, so quiet that he could hear his own heartbeat, steady and firm in his chest. He knelt and placed a hand on the earth. It was cool beneath his palm, firm and damp, real. He whispered softly, not a prayer, not really, but something between a plea and a promise. "If I do not come back, let them remember me as kind. Let them say I stood. Let them know I loved." The wind moved gently through the grass, rustling like a mother's hush. When he returned to the fire, the coals were glowing faintly, and the sky had begun to pale ever so slightly in the east. He lay down beside his friends, pulling the blanket over his shoulders, and there, beneath the watching stars, with the weight of the world pressing gently on his chest, Elias Calhoun closed his eyes and drifted into sleep. It was the longest night, but it passed, as all nights do. And somewhere, in the hush that comes just before dawn, the earth held its breath and waited. Winter crept into the camp not with a storm, but with a whisper, like frost tracing the edge of a window pane, or the breath of wind curling beneath a collar. One morning, the earth simply woke, covered in a thin sheen of white, and every step made a sound like parchment crumpling beneath the boot. Elias Calhoun stood outside his tent, wrapped in a borrowed wool coat too large for his frame, his breath visible in pale clouds. Around him, the camp had slowed. Movements were fewer, quieter. Voices had grown hushed, as if the cold itself discouraged sound. The air smelled of pine smoke, wet canvas, and the faint metallic tang of frozen metal. Winter was not a season in the army. It was a state of being. The regiment had not moved in weeks. Orders came to remain encamped along the southern bend of the Shenandoah River. The ground had grown too hard for trenches, the supply wagons too slow for long marches. The officers spoke of waiting, of resting, regrouping, rebuilding strength. But to the men, it felt more like drifting. Days passed in a blur of grey skies, frozen fingers, and the constant search for warmth. Elias shared a tent with 3 others, Silas, Reuben, and a new recruit named Warren, who had joined just before the frost set in. They slept close, blankets layered and bodies tucked like spoons, turning through the night in awkward choreography. The cold made them kin. Each morning began with a fire, kindled from damp twigs and guarded like treasure. They'd cup there, hands around tin mugs of weak coffee, letting the steam rise into their chilled faces. Breakfast, when it came, was often little more than hardtack or cold beans. But it was enough. The day's duties were few. Patrols along the riverbank, chopping wood when they could find it, patching worn clothes with thread pulled from old socks. The rest of the time, they waited. They talked. They mended themselves, piece by quiet piece. Elias found a strange kind of peace in the stillness. He began writing more. Letters to his mother, to Annabelle, even to his father, though that one took 3 days to finish. He carved small figures, from soft pine, shaping tiny horses and owls with his penknife. He read from a battered book of psalms he had found tucked into an abandoned knapsack. Some nights, he and Silas would take turns reciting passages aloud. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures," Elias read once, his voice soft in the hush of the tent. Silas smiled faintly. "A pasture sounds warm." They laughed, quiet and slow. The snow deepened as December drew on. Trees bent beneath its weight, their branches hanging like bowed heads in a chapel. Ice formed along the riverbanks in delicate lacework, breaking, away with soft splashes when the sun on rare days appeared. The hardest part of winter was not the cold, but the remembering. With fewer distractions, memories returned like guests. Elias often pictured home, the fireplace with its crackling logs, his mother's shawl hanging on the back of her chair, the way Annabelle's laughter echoed through the orchard. He imagined them together at supper, the table set, a chair left, empty, but waiting. One evening, a package arrived, small, wrapped in plain cloth, tied with twine. Elias recognized the handwriting at once. Inside were 3 pairs of knitted socks, a bar of lye soap, a jar of molasses, and a note written in familiar curls. "Dearest Elias, I hope these things reach you with my love wrapped inside them." Annabelle helped with the socks. She sewed her name into one. "We light a candle for you each night. Your father chopped extra wood this week and said, 'The boy'd better be warm.'" I smiled. "I pray the cold has not dimmed your spirit. Spring will return. Until then, keep the fire in your heart alive. Love, Mama." Elias held the socks as though they were relics. He passed them to the others, 1 pair each, and kept Annabelle's for himself. He wore them that night, and the warmth felt less like wool and more like home. The cold tested friendships too. Tempers flared easily when the firewood ran low, or when boots grew wet and stayed that way for days. But the men had grown used to one another. Arguments were short. Silences, more common than apologies, were just as healing. One night, when the wind howled like wolves through the valley, Elias woke to find Reuben crying softly beneath his blanket. He said nothing. He only reached over and rested a hand on Reuben's shoulder. That was enough. And so the days passed, slow, repeating, layered in snow and silence. The war, for the moment, seemed to sleep beneath its own white cover. No cannons, no charges, only the steady beat of breath, the crackle of firewood, the long exhale of waiting. It was in that pause, that deep and breathless lull, that Elias came to understand something new. The heart of a soldier was not made only in battle. It was made in these quiet hours, beside friends, beneath snow-laden trees, in the shared stillness of endurance. It was made in patience, in memory, and in the small kindnesses exchanged beneath frost-rimmed tents. Winter did not break them. It bound them, and when spring came, and it would, they would carry this season with them, tucked beside their letters, stitched into their socks, whispered in their prayers. The snow had begun to melt, slowly, shyly, as though winter had grown weary of its own silence. Patches of brown earth re-emerged, soft and damp beneath the sun's cautious warmth. Icicles wept quietly from tree limbs, their tears forming tiny rivulets in the mud. And with the thaw came the sound of water, of birds returning, of life exhaling after months of holding its breath. Elias Calhoun stood at the edge of the river, where the ice had cracked and drifted downstream in broken sheets. His reflection shimmered in the current, a face leaner now, more shadowed, eyes older than the months could account for. He touched his jaw thoughtfully, feeling the stubble that grew more stubborn with each passing week. He had changed. They all had. The war had not resumed with thunder. It crept back with the return of spring, as if waiting for the land to soften before demanding more blood. Orders came to patrol the southern woods. Small skirmishes flared along the outer roads. Gunfire echoed at dusk and faded before morning. But it wasn't until one overcast afternoon that Elias saw the face of the enemy, up close, unmistakable, and human. He was with Silas and two others, scouting a low ridge near a crossroads where smoke had been spotted the night before. The air was damp, filled with the scent of moss and ash. As they crept through a thicket, weapons raised, they heard the voice. Not a shout, not a call to arms, a simple cough, followed by a quiet groan. They found him slumped against a fallen log, one leg bent at a painful angle, his grey coat soaked in blood. He looked up when they approached, pale and blinking, too weak to reach for his rifle. Silas raised his musket. "Wait," Elias said softly. The man, no older than they were, had blue eyes and trembling hands. His beard was patchy, his boots worn through at the toes. A letter protruded from his coat pocket, stained with mud. He coughed again, and blood tinged his lips. "I'm not fighting," he rasped. "I got turned around, lost." Silas hesitated. Reuben, who stood behind them, frowned. "We can't just leave him." "He's one of them." "The fourth," soldier said, spitting into the dirt. "He's dying," Elias replied. They stood for a moment in the grey hush, the woods watching silently. Then Elias stepped forward and knelt beside the wounded man. He offered water from his canteen, which the man drank greedily, coughing between sips. "Name?" Elias asked. "Benjamin," came the whisper. "Ben. Carter." "Where you from, Ben?" "Tennessee." Silas lowered his weapon. Elias and Reuben fashioned a stretcher from their bedrolls and tree branches. They carried Ben back to camp, slow and careful. No orders had been given to bring in wounded enemies, but no one stopped them. Perhaps mercy moved faster than permission. In the infirmary tent, Clara looked up with tired eyes, but said nothing as they laid him down. She cleaned his wound and stitched it, while Ben stared at the canvas ceiling, mumbling the names of people he hoped were praying for him. Later that evening, Elias sat beside Ben as the lantern flickered low. "Why'd you help me?" the man asked, voice rough with fever. Elias was quiet a moment. Then, because you looked like someone. Ben blinked. Who? Me. The enemy, Elias had learned, did not wear horns or leer with villainy. They coughed. They bled. They whispered names into the night. And they died just the same. Ben did not die. He lingered. Clara said it would be weeks before he could walk. The officers, surprised by his presence, chose not to execute or imprison him, but to hold him under guard. There were rules, even in war, rules about the wounded, about kindness. In the days that followed, Ben spoke more. He had a sister who made quilts, a dog named Red, and a favourite tree he'd carved his name into. He missed cornbread, hated marching, and still cried when he heard church hymns. Elias listened. One night, Ben asked, "What do you think they'll do to us, after all this?" "You mean the war?" Ben nodded. "I don't know," Elias said. "I just hope we remember that we were people first, before the uniforms, before the orders." Ben smiled faintly. "That's a good thing to remember." When spring deepened and the wildflowers began to bloom along the riverbanks, Elias returned to the patrols, but he did so changed. Each time he lifted his rifle, he wondered who stood at the other end, whose mother waited for a letter, whose sister sang into a quiet house. The faces of both sides had begun to blur, not in enemy or ally, but in the shared lines of worry, in the haunted eyes of boys pretending to be men. They were not so different. They never had been. Elias wrote, home that night. "Dear Mama, I met a man today who wore the wrong coat, but had the same fear in his eyes as I've seen in the mirror. His name is Ben. I think you'd like him. We keep fighting, but I wonder more and more what it means to win. Maybe the victory is just surviving with your soul still intact. I think about home often. I think about kindness more. Love, Elias." The war would go on. More battles, more loss. But from that day, Elias saw something new in the smoke. Beyond the flags and shouted orders, he saw faces, and he did not forget them. Desertion, like frost, began quietly, not with loud proclamations or sudden disappearances, but with small changes. A man who no longer spoke at meals, another who stood too long by the road at dusk, watching the trees. There were fewer songs, at the fires. Laughter became brittle. Letters home arrived less frequently, or not at all. And in the hush between duties, a single word sometimes hung in the air like a forbidden prayer. Leave. The whispers came with the spring rains. They arrived. In the corners of tents, behind the cover of stacked firewood, at the banks of the river where no officer could hear. Sometimes it was only a glance, a gesture. Other times, quiet voices shaped secret plans, names kept in shadows. Elias Calhoun noticed it first in Warren, the newest among their company, a boy whose hands never stopped shaking since the last skirmish. He had taken to walking the perimeter of camp at odd hours, flinching at every twig crack. His eyes, once eager, now seemed far away, focused on something beyond the next tree. One morning, Elias found him sitting near the fence line, boots already laced, pack strapped tight. "You going somewhere?" Elias asked gently. Warren looked up, startled. He hesitated, then nodded. I can't do this anymore." Elias didn't speak right away. He crouched beside the younger man and listened to the wind rustle through the pine needles. "You afraid?" he asked finally. Warren's eyes glistened. "Every night, every time I close my eyes, I see him, my friend Thomas, just fall." He smiled at me, and then he was gone. "Just gone." Elias nodded slowly. "I remember my first time seeing that. It stays with you." "I write letters," Warren whispered, "but I don't send them. What's the point? What if I die before they reach home?" A long silence settled between them. Then Elias said, "There's more than one way to fight. Sometimes staying is the braver thing. But if you run, make sure it's towards something, not just away. He stood and left Warren to his thoughts. That night, Warren was gone. No alarm was raised, no pursuit organized. The officers had grown tired of chasing ghosts. The camp buried the truth beneath new orders and fresh drills, but the men felt it. Each absence left a hollow space, like a missing tooth in the mouth of a song, and Warren was not the last. Over the next week, 3 more vanished. One left his boots by the fire, another left a note. The third simply slipped into the woods while on night patrol and was never seen again. Silas took it personally. "Cowards," he muttered as they cleaned their rifles one afternoon. "Maybe," Elias said, "or maybe just done." "You ever think about it?" Silas asked suddenly, looking up. Elias didn't answer right away. He stared at the sky, where the clouds moved slowly, like herds of quiet animals across the heavens. "Yes," he said softly. Silas didn't press. He only nodded. That night, the whispers returned, closer this time, louder. "I heard they made it across the river. There's a farm that hides deserters, gives them work. Better to be alive and shameful than noble and buried." Elias lay awake, the words turning in his mind like leaves caught in a current. He thought of home, of the orchard, and the way the wind smelled just before rain. He imagined walking up the road toward the farmhouse, hearing Annabelle laugh through. The window, he saw his mother's face, weathered but warm, standing on the porch with arms open wide. He also imagined the shame, the questions, the disappointment in his father's eyes, and worst of all, he imagined returning only to find that part of himself had been left behind in the mud and the smoke, never to be reclaimed. The next morning, a storm rolled through the valley. Rain fell hard and steady, turning the camp to muck. Tents sagged under the weight of water. Fires hissed and died. The wind howled through the trees like a wounded animal. Elias stood watch that evening, his coat soaked through, his musket heavy in his arms. Across the camp, men sat huddled under canvas, shadows within shadows. He saw a figure slip through the brush, too small for a deer, too careful for a patrol. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his weapon. He only watched. And then, the figure was gone. Later, as he sat by the fire, Silas joined him with 2 tin cups of coffee. "One more gone," Silas muttered. Elias sipped the bitter warmth and said nothing. "I wonder," Silas continued, "if one day we'll walk too far to find our way back, whether we stay or run." Elias turned the cup in his hands, feeling its heat. "I think we already have," he whispered. But even so, when the bugle called at dawn, he stood. When the orders came to march again, he packed his gear, shouldered his rifle, and fell into line. He stayed, not because he wasn't afraid, but because part of him still believed that there was a road home, and that to reach it, he had to keep walking. The letter came unexpectedly, pressed between 2 pages of an officer's dispatch, and handed off with the evening's mail. Elias Calhoun recognized the handwriting at once, firm, blocky, deliberate. It was his father's. He turned the envelope over in his hands before opening it, as though the weight of the words within might change by waiting. The paper felt stiff, the ink darker than his mother's flowing cursive. When he finally unfolded it by firelight, his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the strange dissonance of hearing a voice he had not known how to miss until now. "Elias, I won't waste ink with pleasantries. You know I was never good with them. Your mother tells me you've been writing, that you are keeping your head down and your boots laced, even when things get hard. That makes me proud, though I've never been one to say it. I wanted to tell you about the orchard. The frost took 3 trees this winter. The peach saplings by the river didn't survive. I cut them down myself last week. Funny, how quiet the place gets when you're the only one with an axe. Annabelle is still singing. She's made up a tune about a soldier with muddy boots and a medal in his pocket. I reckon that's you, in her eyes. I don't know if what we're doing, this war, is right or not. I don't have answers, but I know that coming back is the only way to keep asking. I look forward to seeing your boots on the porch again. Elias read it 3 times before folding it carefully and slipping it into his satchel with the others. But something about this one felt different. It didn't just carry love. It carried recognition, an understanding from a man who had always seemed distant, silent, more shaped by fields and years than by words. That night, Elias lay awake beneath the soft rustle of tent canvas and the gentle drip of melting frost. His thoughts drifted not toward the battlefield, but toward memory. He remembered his father's hands, broad, calloused, smelling always of cedar and soil. He remembered the quiet way he watched storms roll in, how he measured the wind by standing still. He rarely raised his voice, rarely offered praise, but when he nodded across the supper table, it meant more than applause. Elias remembered one spring, long ago, when he was small and the creek behind the barn had swelled with rain. He had tried to jump across, slipped, and soaked himself from head to toe. He cried, not from pain, but from shame. His father had found him on the bank, shivering. He said nothing, just pulled Elias close, wrapped his coat around them both, and sat until the boy stopped crying. That was the kind of love his father offered. Quiet, solid, always there when it mattered most. And now, through war and distance, it had found its way to Elias once more. The next morning, the sun broke clear over the hills, casting golden light across the camp. The men stirred slowly, but with less heaviness than usual. A letter, it seemed, had that power. Not just for Elias, but for others too. Reuben had received a parcel of pecans. Silas found a sketch from his sister tucked inside a page of poetry. Even the officers seemed less grim. "Looks like spring's coming," someone muttered. Elias smiled faintly. Maybe it never left. That afternoon, as the patrols moved out, Elias was assigned to ride ahead with a scout group. They travelled along the ridge where the trees were beginning to bud, tiny green flames against bark. The sky was blue, cloudless, clean. It felt like a day stolen from another life. They stopped to rest near a fence line where a farmhouse once stood, its chimney now crumbling, its fields overgrown. Elias wandered toward the ruins, boots soft against the moss. There, beneath a collapsed beam, he found something strange, a child's wooden toy, half buried in the dirt. A small carved horse, its legs chipped, its mane painted with care. He picked it up gently, brushing away the soil. Someone had lived here. Someone had once planted flowers along this porch, once hung laundry in the sun, once told stories by firelight. That life had gone, like smoke, but the shape of it lingered. As he stood in the ruins, Elias felt as though he had stepped through a veil, not of time, but of understanding. The war was not just fought in fields and forests, it was fought in the quiet spaces people left behind. That night, back at camp, Elias retrieved his father's letter and held it to his chest. He wrote back with slow, deliberate care. "Pa, I got your letter. I read it by firelight, same way you used to read the Farmer's Almanac. I remember the orchard. I remember that time you sat with me by the creek. I think of it often. The boots are still laced, the medal's not in my pocket yet, but I'm trying to earn it, not for glory, but for coming home. If the peach trees are gone, we'll plant new ones. Maybe you can leave a few rows for me to tend when I return. Tell Annabelle her soldier with muddy boots is still marching. Your son, Elias." He folded the page and sealed it with a thread of wax from the lantern. A part of him, long buried beneath uniforms and orders, had stirred again. He was not just a soldier, he was a son, and that made all the difference. It began, as endings often do, with silence. The dawn was pale and colourless, the sky a thin sheet of silver stretched above the hills. The camp stirred only in quiet murmurs, boots brushing against frost-laced grass, coats pulled tighter, rifles slung without conversation. No bugle called, no drumbeat stirred the men into motion. Only the bell. It was small, its chime soft as a breath, rung by Thomas the drummer boy with hands that trembled more than usual. The sound moved like wind through the camp, drawing eyes toward the makeshift chapel tent, where a pine box rested beneath a tattered Confederate flag. The box was plain. No carvings, no brass corners, only smooth wood, sanded by hand, made from what lumber could be spared from the winter stores. Inside lay Private Reuben Carter. He had died 2 nights prior from an infection that had crept too quietly through a wound no one thought fatal. Elias had sat with him the last few hours, holding his hand when the fever broke, wiping his brow, whispering psalms he could not quite remember the words to. Reuben had asked only one thing before the end. "Don't let 'em bury me angry." Elias had promised. And now the promise was kept, wrapped not in grand speeches or parade, but in reverence. The burial was held on a low hill just beyond the ridge where they had once repelled an enemy advance. It overlooked a narrow bend in the river, where willows leaned in perpetual mourning. The ground was soft enough now to yield to shovels. Snow had melted, replaced by the scent of wet earth and wild violets beginning to bloom. The company gathered in slow, solemn procession. No ranks, no commands, just brothers walking side by side, their breath fogging in the cool air, their footsteps careful. Elias and Silas carried the box between them, aided by 2 others. It was heavier than expected, not in weight, but in meaning. Clara, the nurse, followed behind, her hands folded, her face unreadable. She had lost many, but each one etched a new shadow in her gaze. At the gravesite, they lowered the box into the ground. No volley of musket fire, no preacher's sermon, just the wind, the river, the rustle of early spring. Captain Barrett stepped forward, his voice low, rough from disuse. Reuben Carter served with quiet honor. He did what was asked, and more. He was a good man. That's enough. He stepped back. Then Elias knelt. He placed a folded piece of paper atop the casket lid before it was covered. One of Reuben's letters, never sent. The address smudged, but legible. Miss Abigail Carter, Charleston. Elias didn't know what the letter said, but he believed Reuben would want her to have it. They began to shovel earth, slow and measured, until the box was covered and a small wooden cross placed at the head. No name was etched, just the initials, R.C., burned into the grain. When it was done, the men stood in stillness, as if waiting for something they couldn't name. Silas broke the silence. He stepped forward, removed his cap, and began to hum. It was a hymn, low, wavering, but filled with aching beauty. Others joined softly, voices weaving into the wind. "Oh, bury me not on the lone prairie, where coyotes howl and the wind blows free." The song trailed off into silence once more, leaving behind only breath and memory. That night, back at camp, Elias sat alone beside the fire. He held the cross that Reuben had carved weeks ago, meant for a grave that was never supposed to be his. The lines were rough, the edges uneven, but it felt holy in his hands. He thought of the way Reuben always argued with Micah about food, how he could fall asleep mid-sentence, how he folded each letter 3 times exactly, as if the shape mattered. He thought of the moment Reuben had smiled, just before the fever took him, and whispered, "I think I'm ready." Elias wondered what it meant to be ready, to know the war might end without you, to find peace in leaving while others still carried on. He took out his journal and wrote, "Reuben is buried beneath a willow tree. The earth is soft, the river close. I think he would have liked it. We buried him with his words and with our silence. There are no trumpets in these funerals, just footsteps, just firelight, just the sound of a shovel returning to the ground. But we remember. That's what matters. I will remember." Later, as the fire dimmed and the stars blinked awake, Silas sat beside him, offering half a biscuit. "You, all right?" he asked. Elias nodded, just thinking. "About Reuben?" "About all of it." Silas poked the fire with a stick, watching the embers rise. "You think he's free now?" Elias looked toward the ridge, toward the cross barely visible in the moonlight. "Yes," he said softly. "I do." The war continued. Orders came. Marches resumed. But for that one day, the world paused. And in a field where spring was just beginning to breathe, a soldier was laid to rest, not as a casualty, not as a number, but as a man, remembered by friends, wrapped in honor, and buried with care. Spring, when it returned in full, did not arrive gently. It burst into the world with a breathless urgency, as if the earth, long held in winter's stillness, had grown impatient. The fields turned green overnight, trees flowered with sudden joy. Rivers, swollen from melting snow, rushed like wild horses across the land. But the change was not only in the soil and sky, it was in the war itself. Rumors flowed faster than the rivers, whispers of defeats, of shifting lines, of old generals being replaced and fresh faces rising through the ranks. There was talk of the north pushing harder now, of cities threatened, of harbors lost, and more troubling still, of spirits fading among the southern ranks. Captain Barrett spoke less often now, his voice lower, as if guarding against invisible ears. Clara received more wounded than ever before. Her tent stretched beyond its limits, beds shared and blankets stitched together. Ammunition wagons came half-loaded. Provisions grew lean. The tide, once a slow turn, now seemed to surge. Elias Calhoun felt it not only in the news, but in the air around the camp. The men walked with heads bowed slightly lower. Songs around the fire were fewer. Letters took longer to arrive, and longer still to be answered. Even Silas, usually a fount of sly humor and impromptu poetry, had grown quiet. One evening, as the sun bled red into the western trees, Elias found him sitting alone by the river, skimming stones across the current. "They say Richmond's in danger," Silas murmured, eyes fixed on the rippling water. "I heard," Elias replied, lowering himself to the mossy bank. "What do you think happens if it falls?" Elias was silent for a long moment. "I don't know, but I think the land keeps going. The people keep planting. The children keep growing. Maybe the war ends. Maybe it doesn't. But life doesn't ask for permission to return." Silas tossed another stone. It skipped once, then sank. "You ever wonder which side we're really on?" Elias looked at him. The question held no accusation, only weariness. "I think I'm on the side of going home," Elias said softly. "On the side of growing old, of seeing spring come back without having to fight for it." That night, Elias wrote in his journal, "The tide has turned, not just in the maps or the orders, but in us. There is a heaviness now, like rain that never quite falls. But under it all, I still feel something else. Not hope, not yet, but maybe readiness." 2 days later, the regiment was ordered to move east. It was not a retreat, they were told, but a repositioning, a chance to reinforce a weakened flank. But the road they followed was rough and narrow, through towns no longer welcoming. Shutters were closed, fields stood untended. At a crossroads, they passed a family heading west with all they owned packed into a single wagon. A little girl waved to Elias as they passed. He waved back. The march was hard. Rain fell in fits and starts, turning the roads to soup. Boots grew heavy, tempers short. Elias's back ached from the pack, his fingers blistered anew from the chafing of his rifle strap. At night, sleep was fitful, dreams filled with sounds that never left. Distant cannon, cries for help, the rustle of unseen footsteps. But still, they marched. On the 5th day, They reached a hill that overlooked a valley, where once a town had stood. Now, only chimneys rose like gravestones from the blackened earth. The buildings had burned long ago. What remained were cinders and silence. They camped there, too tired to search further. Elias sat on a fallen beam, watching the smoke from the campfires drift into the purple sky. Silas joined him, wordless, their shoulders close. "I dreamed of home last night," Elias said suddenly. "Not in war, just home. The orchard, the porch, my father sitting beside me." Silas nodded. "Me too, except in mine, everything was quiet. No drills, no marching, just the sound of birds." Elias smiled faintly. "Maybe the tide's not just turning out there," he said, motioning toward the horizon. "Maybe it's turning in us too." The next day brought a strange stillness. Scouts returned with no news of skirmish. The officers stood longer in their meetings, emerging with uncertain faces. Supplies arrived late, without explanation, but none of it felt urgent. It felt like a pause, like the air before thunder, a moment caught between two winds. That evening, Elias wrote home. "Dearest Mama, the tide is turning. I can feel it in the air, in the footsteps, in the way the sky looks different now. I don't know if it means the end is near, but something has changed. We walk slower now, not from fatigue, but from thought. We talk more about what comes next, and less about what has passed. I keep thinking of Annabelle's song, the one about the soldier and the medal. Maybe there is no medal, maybe just the road home. Love, Elias." And as the fire died low and the wind shifted through the valley, Elias lay on his bedroll and listened, not to the drums or the rifles, but to the quiet. A different kind of silence. Not the silence of fear, but of something nearing, something new, something perhaps like peace. The road east was narrow and winding, carved into the hills like a scar, visible, enduring, and slow to heal. It traced the edge of forests half burned, fields abandoned to thistle, and rivers that had long since forgotten the taste of peace. On either side, the remnants of war lingered, wagons overturned, fences broken, homes left to weather and ruin. It was down this road that Elias Calhoun marched, step after step, in what the officers now openly called the final campaign. No one said it with joy. There were no banners raised, no declarations of glory, only the steady crunch of boots over gravel, the soft thud of packs against backs, and the quiet panting of men who had marched too long under too many skies. The army was thinner now. Illness, wounds, and time had worn them down. Faces Elias once saw every morning at breakfast were gone, some buried, some missing, some quietly departed under the cover of night. The uniforms were frayed, the rifles dulled, but the men still moved forward, because that was all they had left. Forward, the weather had warmed, but not kindly. The heat came in waves, thick and muggy, settling into every fold of cloth. Flies buzzed constantly. Water was scarce, rations even more so. Elias had learned to chew slowly, to conserve each swallow. Hunger no longer came in pangs, but in a dull ache that lived just beneath the ribs. But harder than the hunger, harder even than the miles, was the waiting. The waiting for news, the waiting for orders, the waiting for the end. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind a ridge of blackened pines, the regiment made camp in the ruins of a stone church. Only the outer walls remained, moss-covered and cracked. The roof had long since fallen in, but there was a peace in it still, as if the stones remembered their purpose and refused to forget how to bless. Elias wandered inside what remained of the sanctuary. He sat where the altar might have once stood, now only a slab of wood overgrown with ivy. He closed his eyes, not to pray, not exactly, but to listen to the sound of wind through the open archways, to the quiet song of birds in the rafters, to the beat of his own heart. Slower now, heavier. Silas found him there, You thinking? He asked, settling beside him. Always. About what? Elias hesitated. About what comes after. If there's an after. Silas looked up at the twilight sky, the first stars peeking through. I think about that too. About standing in the orchard again. About hearing my sister read out loud. Like she used to. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Silas said, "Do you think we'll know it's the end? Or will it just stop?" Elias looked down at his hands. "I think we'll know, because something inside us will exhale." The next morning brought news. Real, trembling, almost impossible news. Lee was retreating. The Union had broken through to the west. Cities were falling, lines were scattering, and somewhere, rumors said, peace talks had begun. The reaction in camp was quiet. There was no cheering, no rushing forward, only a shared glance, passed from man to man, as if to ask, can it be true? Can we believe again? But the march did not stop. Orders were given to continue toward Appomattox. Reinforcements were rumored to gather there. Final resistance. Last breath. And so they marched, each step closer to something unknown. Elias felt the change with each mile, not in his body, though it ached more each day, but in his spirit. The heaviness began to shift slightly, like ice melting in the sun, like a long-held sorrow preparing to loosen its grip. One night, as they rested beneath a grove of elms, Elias took out the last page of his journal. He wrote slowly, the words coming like leaves falling, one at a time, soft and inevitable. There is a feeling now, like standing on the edge of a great lake, hearing waves in the dark, knowing the sun is about to rise. I am not the same boy who left Bell Hollow, but I have not lost him. He walks beside me, quieter now, wiser perhaps. If this is the end, let it be gentle. Let it carry us home, not as victors or vanquished, but as men who endured. And if we reach that place, I will plant peach trees with my father. I will tell Annabelle stories. I will sit beside my mother and listen to the wind, and I will remember. He folded the journal and tucked it away. Nearby, Silas snored softly. Thomas curled like a kitten beside a dwindling fire. Somewhere in the woods, an owl called, lonely and proud. The march was not yet done, the end not yet declared, but they were near now. So near that the stars seemed to shine brighter. The wind smelled of something green, and even the silence felt softer. And as Elias closed his eyes, he imagined the road bending toward a place called home. Not far now, just a few steps more. There came a morning when the guns did not fire. No thunder rolled through the valleys. No drums called the men to formation. No cries of charge echoed across the hills. The wind moved gently through the camp, rustling the canvas like a sigh. And in that hush, the world felt whole again, just for a moment. Elias Calhoun woke to the silence and did not know what to make of it. At first, he thought it was a trick of sleep, that the stillness would break, that the routine of noise and orders would resume. But as the sun climbed, golden and slow, the camp remained quiet. Men moved softly, whispering, glancing at one another with tentative hope. Then came the word, the war was ending. Lee had surrendered. The news travelled from tent to tent, whispered from soldier to soldier, not as a cry of triumph, but as something too fragile to say aloud. It was true. The fighting was finished. The march had ended. The guns had fallen silent. Elias stood near the chapel ruins where they had camped days before. He looked up at the sky, wide and pale blue, and for the first time in a long while, it felt safe to breathe deeply. Silas approached from behind, holding his cap in both hands. "It's over," he said quietly. Elias nodded. "I thought it'd feel different," Silas admitted. "Louder, brighter." "Me too," Elias replied. "But maybe this is better." They sat together on a low stone wall, watching the river glint in the sunlight. In the days that followed, there was no great celebration, no fireworks, no parades, just a slow return of noise and colour. Laughter crept back into the camp, hesitant at first. Letters poured in, thick with joy and disbelief. The cook found a stash of cinnamon and baked sweet biscuits that vanished before they cooled. Men began to speak of home not as memory, but as destination. The journey back would be long. Some units would remain to help rebuild. Others, like Elias's, were to be mustered out within the month. But the urgency was gone. Time, once driven by battle, now moved like a lazy stream. Elias spent his final days in camp gathering small things. A feather he found near the willow tree, a smooth stone from the riverbed, a ribbon someone had tied to a post long ago. He placed them in a pouch beside his journal and letters, pieces of the life he had lived here, the version of himself formed under canvas and sky. When the order came to depart, he dressed slowly, tying each bootlace with care. His uniform, though faded and worn, felt like armor and memory stitched into one. He looked at his reflection in a tin plate, thinner now, older, eyes steadier than they'd ever been. Before he left, Elias walked alone to Reuben's grave beneath the willow. The small wooden cross still stood, weathered but upright. He knelt and placed the smooth stone beside it. "I'm going home," he whispered. "I'll take you with me, always." He stood, heart full, and turned toward the road. The march back to Bell Hollow was not fast. The horses walked slow. The wagons groaned under the weight of men and memory. But with each mile, the air grew sweeter, the land more familiar. The wounds they carried, seen and unseen, eased with every step toward the lives they had left behind. One afternoon, just as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Elias saw the edge of his family's orchard. The trees were in bloom, pale pink, blossoms trembling in the breeze. He stopped for a moment, hand to his chest, breath caught between joy and disbelief. Then he walked on. Annabelle was the first to see him. She screamed his name and ran down the path, hair flying behind her like a banner of gold. He dropped his pack and caught her in his arms, lifting her into the air, her laughter echoing through the trees. His mother stood on the porch, hand to her mouth, tears running freely. His father stepped forward, face unreadable for a moment. Then he opened his arms and pulled Elias close, holding him in silence. No words were needed. That night, they sat around the hearth as they once had. The same fire crackled, the same clock ticked softly on the mantel. But something had changed. The house was not smaller or quieter. It was fuller, brighter. Annabelle made him tell stories. His mother passed him extra bread. His father simply nodded when Elias spoke, a hand resting on his shoulder, firm and steady. Before bed, Elias stepped outside. The night air was cool and fragrant with blossoms. The stars blinked gently above, old and familiar. He walked to the edge of the orchard and sat beneath the tree he used to climb as a boy. He opened his journal and wrote one last time, "I have returned, whole in body, changed in soul." The war took much, but it gave something too. A truth I didn't know I was searching for. That peace is not the absence of noise, it is the presence of stillness. That home is not a place, but a promise kept, and that even when the guns fall silent, their echoes shape the way we live. I will plant new trees. I will tell the stories. I will remember. I am home. Elias closed the book. The wind stirred gently through the trees, and in the hush that followed, the past and present met, not with sorrow, not with thunder, but with a whisper, just like it began.